One of the common fears of childhood is of the hidden danger lurking under your bed. How many children have taken a running leap into bed to avoid a clutching hand grab them by the ankle? As we grow up, we know there's nothing to be afraid of hiding in the dark under the bed, except maybe a killer. Elsie Mae Rowe was born in 1910. She married when she was still young in 1927 and had 3 children with her husband, Cyril Wheeler. In October 1946, Cyril divorced his wife, citing adultery with a man named Alfred Coates Griffin. The same month, Elsie reported that £135 in notes had been stolen from her home in George Street, Theberton. Elsie was described as a quiet, homely sort of woman who was popular with women and children. Alfred Griffin had also been married and divorced twice. He divorced his first wife, Winifred, for adultery in April 1943. His second marriage was brief. After a dispute over money, his wife told him to leave the house in 1945. On the 10th of January 1946, he met Elsie Wheeler. He claimed that they were mutually attracted, but as she was a married woman, he sold his car and planned to go to the country to avoid temptation. When Elsie found out, she said she wanted to go with him. She phoned him up and wrote letters asking to meet him. Following her divorce, they began living together. Griffin was then divorced by his second wife, Ellen, in May 1947. Griffin and Wheeler had lived together at Kent Town for a period until January 1948, when they went to live separately. Griffin claimed it was interference on behalf of one of Elsie's daughters which caused the split. Elsie Wheeler lived in a rented room in Hutt Street, Adelaide, where she had dwelt for 2 years. When she took the room, she told her landlady that she was going to marry Griffin. Elsie lived with her 17-year-old daughter Barbara. Occasionally her son Robert, aged 11, would stay there, but he and her eldest daughter usually lived with their father. On the 23rd of December 1949, Barbara went on a camping holiday to Victor Harbour for Christmas. Elsie Mae Wheeler and her friend Lily Mae King were enjoying the Christmas celebrations together in 1949. The women, aged 39 and 31, worked together as egg testers, along with one of Elsie's daughters, and had become close over the past 6 months. The 2 women had also been on a kindergarten committee together. Lily often stayed over at her friend's home on Friday and Saturday nights. On Christmas Eve, the 2 women went shopping for the holiday. They spent some time in the Hampshire Hotel, but when leaving encountered Griffin. As they neared a fish and chip shop in Grote Street, Griffin said, "Here's your Christmas present," and gave Elsie a string of pearls. The ladies entered the fish shop to have a meal. After a while, Griffin followed them in, but sat at another table and ignored them. At some point, Elsie and Griffin went outside and argued on the footpath. Before this day, Lily had always enjoyed the time spent in the company of Griffin. Lily overheard Elsie tell Griffin to come around on Monday, that she had a shirt for him for a Christmas gift. He replied, "They don't wear shirts where I'm going." Griffin said he was going to throw himself under a tram or a train. Elsie remarked to Lily that she had heard that comment so often she took no notice any longer. When they got home, Elsie's eldest daughter Rhonda, who was 21, visited her mother and stayed for a while. Mrs. Mabel Bush, the landlady, saw Elsie wearing the pearls Griffin had given her, but she told Mabel she was going to throw them back at him. Mabel told her not to be silly. Christmas Day was spent at 63 Light Terrace, Theberton, where Elsie's elderly parents lived. The family gathering included Elsie's 8 siblings. The weather was a beautiful 81 degrees Fahrenheit. During the day, Elsie mentioned to her brother-in-law, Thomas Johnson, that following Griffin's behaviour the previous evening, she was a bit frightened of him. While the women were enjoying the evening, Griffin was lingering in Hutt Street. About midnight he went into Elsie's room. He later said he wanted to talk to her. Instead, he got down under the bed and concealed himself, a knife in his pocket. The 2 women arrived at 158 Hutt Street shortly after midnight. Lily came in first and got some glasses so they could have a drink. Then they prepared to share a bed for the night. Elsie asked Lily to lock the door. As they lay down preparing to drift off to sleep, they chatted about men and about their plans for the next day. They were going to attend the Boxing Day horse races at Cheltenham Racecourse and go for a picnic at Port Noarlunga with Griffin and another man. The man under the bed was listening and growing angry as he heard Elsie talking about men she knew. The women fell asleep and all was quiet for a while. Then Griffin took off his necktie and his shoes, and at about 2:15 a.m. emerged from his hiding place. He claimed later that he had no intention of hurting Elsie when he crept from under the bed and had woken her and spoken with her. In his evidence at the coronial inquest in January 1950, Griffin said Elsie never responded to him, but at his trial there was an elaborate conversation he detailed. Elsie said she'd speak with him on Monday. She registered no surprise he had appeared in a locked room, if his account is true. He then asked her all about the men on Christmas Eve, afternoon, night, and Christmas night. He said she laughed, and said she had 2 other men the previous Friday night. He then said that he was going to do away with himself. She said that he was not worth it, and he then said that he ought to cut her throat too. He had no intention of hurting her then, he later claimed, but he just went mad. He claimed she had added in a gloating voice, "You don't have the guts to do it." This, he said, put the idea of killing her into his head for the first time. If they had said anything, it failed to rouse Mrs. King, who was right next to Elsie, let alone this long conversation with laughter. Griffin had a boot knife. It was very sharp, and using a lot of force he pressed the blade down on the dozing woman's throat and cut a deep slash. Then he raised the body of the dying woman and kissed her on the lips. Mrs. King woke to a gurgling sound in the darkened room and realised that a pair of hands were grasping her throat. She tried to scream, but found she could not. Griffin released one hand, and Lily asked him what he had done. He replied, "I've just killed Elsie." Lily asked him to put the light on, saying maybe there was something they could do for Elsie. Instead he replied, "You can't do anything. There's a 9-inch gash in her throat." He added that she should keep quiet, or he would do her too. Lily recognised the voice as Alfred Coates Griffin and begged him not to hurt her for the sake of her children. He leaned over the dying woman and said, "I'm going to my wife." Lily pleaded that she couldn't lay next to a blood-soaked body of her friend, so Griffin put a pillow at the foot of the bed and made her lie there. Holding her down with one hand, he announced that he was going to cut his own throat. As he felt on the floor for the knife, she tried to make for the door, but he told her to keep still or he would kill her. Then he put the blade to his own throat. "I can't do it. I'm going to hang myself," he said. He then told Lily to give him 3 minutes to get away. Coates then couldn't get the door open, so had Lily unlock it for him. Again he warned she had to give him 3 minutes, or he would kill her. Griffin fled without his shoes, leaping over the fence and wandered through the city to the banks of the Torrens River. Here he tried to hang himself from a tree, but failed because the rope stretched too much, according to his statement. He made cuts to his throat and left wrist, but the wounds were superficial. Having done so, he threw the knife into the dark waters of the river. Lily, meanwhile, had run outside and found 3 men in a car who phoned for the police for her. Within 10 minutes of the murder, police were on the scene. A manhunt was quickly put into action in nearby streets, the parklands, and Victoria Park Racecourse, but Griffin eluded the searchers. Police also visited Griffin's sister, Edna Williams, at Adam Street, Hindmarsh, where he had lived since 1948. Lily was later taken to hospital and given cold compresses for a bruised larynx from her tussle with Griffin. Pug holes, the excavations made by digging out clay to make bricks, existed to the west of the city near Hindmarsh. At 5:30 a.m. on the 27th of December, somebody reported a man who might have been the wanted man at a pug hole in West Theberton. Working on a hunch that Griffin may have gone to hide in one of them because he had once worked at a brick kiln, police began a search. It appeared their gambit was going to be a failure, as site after site revealed nothing. Until at 4 p.m. they reached the penultimate location on their list, J. Hallerton Son Limited Brickworks on West Theberton Road. Here, in a shed, they found Griffin lying on a pile of sacks. The arresting officers informed him that Elsie had died. He responded, "I cut her throat with the same knife that I used on my own throat. I decided that I would kill her on Saturday night after an argument. She had been getting around with other men, 5 or 6 of them." In his paranoia, Griffin claimed that although there were no men with Elsie, as he expected to find when he hid under the bed, there were a couple outside, possibly the men who Lily asked for help later. The wounds he'd inflicted on himself seemed slight, so he was taken to the watch house first to be charged with murder, and then to hospital for his cuts to be stitched up. Griffin was kept in hospital under police guard until the 3rd of January 1950. On the same day he was captured, Elsie May Wheeler was buried at Cheltenham Cemetery, just a short distance from the racecourse she had intended to visit on the day she died. On the 29th of December 1949, he was remanded in custody until the 12th of January 1950. When he was asked if he wanted bail, he replied, no. Griffin had a criminal record, but it was minor, and he was considered a mild individual. He left school when he was 14 and came to the attention of police in 1929, when he was 17. He and a 21-year-old mate named Alfred Millington stole Mrs. Ogilvy's car, a Whippet, from Renmark on the 12th of November and took it on a journey of over 2,000 miles, driving through Morgan and Clare to Brinkworth. Having stolen some fuel, they kept going to Port Pirie, Port Augusta, and to Whyalla. Then they turned around and drove back to Brinkworth, where they stole more fuel and oil from the same depot they had raided before. They drove through Clare and Morgan and headed towards the Darling River in New South Wales. Here they drove about in the country until the car broke down on the 25th of November, and they abandoned it and started walking for home. 3 weeks after their jaunt had began, they arrived back in Renmark. Millington was fined £25, and Griffin was sentenced to the Boys' Reformatory until he turned 18. The following year, Griffin was charged with attempted bestiality. He was arrested on the 25th of June 1930, but no details of the allegation were made public, and after a trial in October, was found not guilty. 10 years later, in October 1940, he was fined £2 for using indecent language, and in September 1947 he was given a 3-month sentence for stealing building materials, which he carried in his truck, and stealing some light fittings off another lorry to fit to his truck. Nothing, however, suggested that Alfred Griffin, alias Alfred Harold Cock, would be standing trial for murder. The trial began on the 21st of February 1950 before the Chief Justice, Sir Mellis Napier. Griffin pleaded not guilty. His lawyers attempted to argue that he had suffered temporary insanity at the time of the murder. In court, 3 letters which Griffin had written to relatives were tendered in evidence. In 2 of them he had written, "Please do not cry over me, because I am not worth it." Dr. Southwood, who examined Griffin in jail a week earlier, testified that there was no evidence of abnormality of the mind. Dr. Hugh Birch, who examined him 4 times, concurred. There was no sign of any disorder. Griffin had been injured in June 1949 when a tyre tube blew out and the steel rim struck him in the head. His sister Edna reported that she had noticed some changes in his behaviour following the accident, but its effect on his actions was dismissed by the experts in court. Griffin's sister also said in court that her brother had spoken of plans to save money to buy a block of land and to marry Elsie Wheeler. When asked why he was carrying a knife on Christmas Eve, he claimed he had forgotten it was in his pocket from a few days before. He had intended to fight any man with Elsie, but not harm her. The trial was quick. There was no dispute that Griffin had been the man in the room and that he had cut Elsie's throat. When the jury returned a verdict of guilty after 19 minutes of deliberation at 4:17 p.m. on the 22nd of February, it was no surprise to anyone. The Chief Justice passed the death sentence, and Griffin, who took the news impassively, was taken back to Adelaide Jail. An appeal was made to the State Parliament for a reprieve by the Australian Labor Party, who had an abolitionist platform, and the Trades and Labour Council, the organising body for trade unions in South Australia. On the 20th of March, the Executive Council met to discuss a reprieve. They chose not to interfere in the course of justice. Griffin spent the 21st of March in the condemned cell with officers of the Salvation Army. Wednesday, 22nd of March, was the day that Griffin was to hang. It was a cool morning. The execution was scheduled for 8 a.m. At 7:30 a.m, 10 police began patrolling the perimeter of the jail in case of any trouble. At 7:50 a.m, Mrs. Ivy Cooter rode in on her bicycle from the nearby suburb of Mile End. She usually attended every hanging at the Adelaide jail. As a form of protest against the death penalty, she would stand and quietly read a passage from her Bible. She was the only protester or friend there that day. Griffin's relatives had visited him the day before, but Mrs. Cooter had arrived willing to comfort any of his relatives who might have been there that day. One of his relatives, who had brought flowers, which they were unable to place on his grave, sent them to Mrs. Cooter as a thank you. Griffin walked calmly to the gallows in the new building at the jail and was hanged without incident. 50 minutes after death, the sheriff handed the coroner the warrant, bearing a 2-inch black seal and black ribbon, sentencing Griffin to death. It was the last execution on those gallows, which had been in use since 1894. The last 4 men executed in South Australia after Griffin were hanged instead in the hanging tower. The body of Alfred Coates Griffin was buried in the grounds of the jail. Whether the shock of his daughter's murder had anything to do with it or not, Elsie's father died just 6 months after her, at the age of 80, on the 12th of May 1950. Her mother lived to be 91 and passed away in July 1966.